Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Good afternoon to all. Tamil Nadu Science Forum welcome you all. This is the 25th lecture in the popular science lecture series. Today we are having our guest lecturer, Dr. Satyajit Rath. He is going to be introduced by Mr. P.K. Rajan. We are conducting the meeting regularly through the web, the web application Discord. We will continue to do so. So you will be getting the announcement of the next meeting soon. Let me hand over the. Before we start the meeting, I invite P.K. Rajan to introduce the Tamil Nadu Science Forum as well as the speaker. So later he will hand over the mic to speaker.
Thank you, Vijay. Good evening, friends. I, on behalf of Tamil Nadu Science Forum, welcome you all to the 25th Popular Science Lecture. As a participant of this Popular Science Lecture, you may be aware, this is one of the activities of Tamil Nadu Science Forum. Tamil Nadu Science Forum is a people science movement working in Tamil Nadu for the last 30 plus years. We are there in every nook and corner of Tamil Nadu, almost in all the taluks, certainly in all the districts with our district committees. We have many modules, and just one of that is Popular Science Lecture, which is part of our science popularization module. We have a module to intervene in the educational system of Tamil Nadu. Our teachers, our experts, they are working very closely with the Tamil Nadu Educational Board in forming the syllabus, in enhancing the syllabus, enhancing the textbooks, and enhancing the education methodology, the pedagogy, etc. We have a separate module called Samam, which is working for self-help groups, through self-help groups, to the women to empower them. We are running the self-help groups as an example so that women in Tamil Nadu, mostly in the rural areas, they can form their own self-help group and they can be on their own leg, make themselves economically independent to start with, and other independence will follow suit. We have a publication division on our own called Science Publications, in which we are publishing books about science, scientific attitude, taking science to the people who didn't have science education after the school, and even to the people who are experts in one particular stream, but who are like any other common people as far as the other streams are concerned. We are running a children's science magazine called Tulir for the last 30 plus years. In Tamil Nadu, apart from the commercially run magazines, Tulir is the top selling magazine with 40,000 subscribers. It is going to every nook and corner, almost every school where Tamil is a medium of instruction. But in a state like Tamil Nadu and in the city of Chennai, where there are a lot of people, a lot of students, a lot of children who can't read Tamil, we are running a children's science magazine in the name of Jandar Mandar, which is also going for 30 plus years. We have a separate module to intervene in the process of growth, development, and environmental protection of the state. In fact, personally, I was working in that particular module. So, to anybody who is having any kind of interest in science, we have space to work in. We have friends to work with you if you are interested in any of the work concerned with the science. You may be interested in popularizing science. You may be interested in exposing the frontier of sciences. You may be interested in helping the self-help group of women. You may be interested in writing science to the children. whatever be your interest, whatever be your plane in which you are interested in science, we have space, we have friends, we have projects, we have works, and we have happiness to share with you. So just not being a spectator and a listener to this science lectures, we invite you to be among us. We invite you to join our hands with us, walk with us, work with us, and be happy with us. With these words, I like you all to become member of the Tamil Nadu Science Forum to make our endeavor much more broader, much more deeper, and much more richer in all aspects. With these few words, I like to introduce today's speaker, and we are privileged to have Dr. Satyajit Rath among us. Dr. Satyajit had his undergraduation from Pune University and his master's in medicine in pathology in Bombay University. He is right now Agarkar chair at the Agarkar Research Institute in Pune, and earlier he has worked in many prestigious organizations and research institutes. He is adjunct faculty member at the Indian Institute of Science Education and Research in Pune, adjunct faculty at the Translational Health Science and Technology Institute at Faridabad, India, adjunct faculty member at the Christian Medical College here in Vellore, India. He was scientist at the National Institute of Immunology, New Delhi, from 91 to 2017, working on antigen processing, TNB cell development, activation, and tolerance. He was a research associate in Howard Hughes Medical Institute in the Section of Immunology, Yale University of Medicine, New Haven, USA. He was research associate, Howard Hughes Medical Institute, Section of Immunology. He was research associate at the Rosenthal Research Center, Brandeis University in USA. He was with Wellcome Trust earlier as a research fellow at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, research associate at a Hopkins Institute, Bombay in India, which is specialized in this kind of epidemiology. You know, the old story of plague in India, wherein Hopkins Institute was installed at the time, and they are doing a yeoman service for India in the field of epidemiology. And Dr. Satyajit is working there too. He was a research fellow at the Hopkins Institute in Bombay. He has published more than 99 peer-reviewed papers and many more non-peer-reviewed papers. So we are very privileged to have Dr. Satyajit with us. Now with these words, I welcome him. Dr. Satyajit, now it is time for you. I hand over the handle to you. Thank you very much. And let us listen to Dr. Satyajit.
Dr. Satyajit, I have one small announcement. So after this meeting, I request all the participants to fill up their feedback forms. We provide the link for the feedback forms. So last meeting, we got a feedback form. 10 of us has filled up the forms. I can just read what has been written there. Dr. Poonam Sethi, she was a regular attendee of our meeting, and she says that the meeting is very good. And we received a feedback from Vishnu Gayatri. She said, indeed, it is an eye-opening session. And we got a feedback from Priya. She says, the session is really good. And we get Malarvidi. She said, doctor's explanation was clear and answer to all questions. And we got feedback from Mahendran. We got feedback from Vignesh. We got feedback from Akshaya. Akshaya was the first attendee of that. She said it was nice. And we also got feedback from Mohammed Ibrahim. We got feedback from Dr. K.M. Balasubramanian. We got feedback from Deva Prakash. So please fill up your feedback. Once the meeting is over, we have provided the link in the chat box. Dr. Satyajit, you can go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues and friends. The what I'm choosing to talk about today is a general problem, particularly in India, of activist groups and movements that work in the field of science and society. And that is the idea of scientific temper. This is an idea that is quite uniquely a constitutional issue for India, unlike anywhere else. It's a constitutional responsibility. To what extent we succeed in assimilating scientific temper is a whole different question altogether, and a far more general one. What I would like to talk about today, however, is a more specific perspective of the field of scientific temper. And that is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted our ideas, notions of scientific temper, which is why scientific temper in COVID-19 times. I apologize, I don't do very well either in speeches in general or online speeches in particular. So you will forgive me, and that you have to put up with simply seeing my face on the screen rather than this kind of slides and data that friends of mine who have spoken in this forum earlier, such as Sitabra, I'm sure have shown. Before I start, I have a request and a question, which is, I hope that we are going to do this in part at least as question and response. Not that I have answers to give, but I certainly hope that we can have responses to questions and discussion. And I'm not sure how we're going to do that, but I'm going to leave that to our comrades organizing to deal with. I will speak for some time to lay out what I see as issues confronting the ideas of scientific temper in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. So what I'm going to do is take specific examples one by one and relate the notions of scientific temper on the one hand and COVID-19 related issues on the other. And one of those is very evident and straightforward in people's responses to the pandemic. I have relatives, I'm sure all of us have relatives, who are terribly afraid of stepping out of their houses, who are afraid of the newspaper, who are afraid of buying vegetables, buying groceries. And all of this is because they're terrified that they're going to catch COVID-19 from all of these. It's a different matter, and we can discuss that if anybody's interested. It's a different matter to what extent these fears are justified. The reason I bring this issue up in the context of scientific temper is to make the argument that as a society, we are missing the societal concern point of the pandemic. The pandemic is caused by a relatively new coronavirus, whose acquaintance with us as a species is less, as far as we can tell, at the moment at least, less than a year old. And there are things about this virus that we don't still know, but there are things that we do know. And one of those things that all of us miss is that infection by this virus is not a major individual risk. What do I mean by that? So let me clarify this in quantitative terms. What I mean is, you can have new viruses coming in. Supposing this had been a new virus coming into human being, But all it did was cause what some other members of the coronavirus family already cause, which is a common cold. You have a little bit of cough and cold for 2, 3, 4 days, and then it goes away. If a new coronavirus had caused only a common cold, would it have been a pandemic? Yes, in the technical sense, it would have been a pandemic in the sense that all of us would have been susceptible because it's an entirely new virus. All of us would sooner or later have gotten infected, but it wouldn't have mattered to us. We wouldn't even have noticed. In fact, who knows how many pandemics in the technical sense we don't notice because they do not lead to severe disease. But that's one end of the scale. The other end of the scale is constituted by viruses such as Ebola. So the Ebola virus causes, if the Ebola virus causes infection in 10 people, 3 or 4 out of those 10 people are likely to die. That's an enormous mortality rate. So these are the two extremes. A virus or an infectious microbe that does not kill or that does not cause severe disease at all, and an infectious microbe that causes severe illness in an extraordinarily high proportion of the people that it infects. You will imagine that we will go from being not at all concerned, not even noticing the arrival of a new infection at one end of this spectrum, we will begin to worry more and more and more and more and more until we come to something like Ebola, something like MERS, the so-called very colonially named Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome virus, the so-called SARS virus from 17, 18 years ago, all of which kill between 10 to 30% of infected people. And therefore, we would be deeply worried about them. Now, the point I'm going to try and make here that's specific is this increase in worry is in two distinct dimensions. One dimension is, of course, the individual risk. Do I worry about catching a cold? No. Would I worry if I were likely to catch Ebola virus infection? Absolutely, yes. And you will appreciate that this shift of my own worry for my own individual health is driven by what amounts to the mortality rate. So it's a reasonable question for us to ask, what is the mortality rate of the COVID-19 pandemic caused by the new coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2? And there are two answers to this that we are, as a society, profoundly uncomfortable. One, the answer that we don't know the answer to this question. What is the mortality rate? And the reason we don't know the answer to this question is the following. How do you calculate a mortality rate? Simple and straightforward. How many people were infected, and out of 100 people infected, how many people died? Do we know how many people died? Kind of, sort of, although in a variety of countries, for a variety of reasons, mortalities are thought to be underestimated. But let's say we kind of at least know how many people died. That's the numerator. The denominator is how many people were infected. And we don't know a good answer to that. The reason we don't know a good answer to that with SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 is that the majority of instances of infection by SARS-CoV-2 lead to either infection with no symptoms or infection with very mild symptoms. Whether this number is, whether the total percentage of asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic SARS-CoV-2 infections is as low as 75% or as high as 98%. I've heard both numbers argued by my colleagues. Is still being debated, and it's being debated as a result of this enormous group of asymptomatic infected individuals. Because if somebody is infected but does not show symptoms, how would we know that that person was infected? And therefore, we would overlook adding that person to our denominator. And as a result, the majority of estimates of the mortality of SARS-CoV-2 infection, which ranges currently from anywhere near 1.5 or 2% to as much as 7 or 8%, depending on which country, which time, and so on and so forth you're looking at. These are all likely to be overestimates because the denominator does not include everybody who is infected but is simply not shown any illness at all. So we don't have a good estimate of mortality. What do we know about mortality? What we know about mortality is that it's likely to be somewhat more than the mortality of seasonal influenza, which is thought to be somewhere in the vicinity of 1 in 1,000, 1 in 1,500, 1 in 2,000 people. SARS-CoV-2, the current guesstimate is going to be somewhere in the vicinity of 1 in 200 as a mortality rate. And when you think about it like that, when you think about a less than 1% mortality rate for SARS-CoV-2, you turn around and say, yeah, but then it's not as dangerous as, say, Ebola, or as the original SARS, or as MERS. And yet, we are still worrying about it. So here's where my problem arises. Remember my spectrum going from a coronavirus that causes the common cold all the way to the coronaviruses that cause 10%, 20%, 30% mortality. And SARS-CoV-2 is closer to this end than to this end. As a result, I'm suggesting that our individual risk and worry of dying of SARS-CoV-2 is not enormously high. And yet, quite contrary to how we would have responded if we had truly assimilated scientific temper, our primary response is a response of individual fearing. What will happen to me is what people are worrying about. At most, people are worrying to what will happen to my children. What should we be worrying about? And what we should be worrying about, I'm arguing, is the other category of risk. What is that? And that is, rather than individual risk, it is community risk. It is societal risk. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, if you have a virus that spreads reasonably efficiently from one person to another, as SARS-CoV-2 does, it may show differences in different parts of the country, different parts of the world, in how efficiently it spreads and so on, but it certainly spreads reasonably efficiently. With a completely new virus that spreads efficiently, the likelihood is that very large numbers of people will get infected by the virus in a very short period of time, simply because it transmits so rapidly between people. Its incubation time is short, so it's spread in communities very widely. Here's where our societal risk and problem arises. Because if we have very large numbers of us infected, then even if the percentage of people who will become seriously sick as a result is low, because the total number of infected people is very large, the absolute numbers of people who are seriously, severely sick and who therefore need hospitalization, who need specialized medical equipment in order to keep their bodies supported and functional over the duration of time that their bodies deal with the virus infection. The demands on our medical facility are likely to be enormous. Let me give you the example of what happened when this kind of explosive spread happened in late March, April, in, for example, Italy. Medical facilities were overwhelmed to the point that, to put it crudely, everybody who needed oxygen and a ventilator and related critical care hospital beds could not get one, which means that this is a virus and an epidemic that's a societal risk in the sense that because of the speed with which it spreads in us as a completely susceptible and naive community, we will have people dying, not because they were so sick that they were going to die, but because we as a society could not offer them the medical care that should be our fundamental human right. And that should be unacceptable to us as societies. And that is what we should be able to both think about, measure, and respond to. This is what I mean by two separate kinds of risk. The risk of individual infection. Am I going to die of infection? And the risk that not I, but we as a society will have an explosive growth in the number of people severely ill with this infection to the extent that our hospital facilities, our medical facilities will simply not be able to keep pace. And I suggest that we have, as a society, have begun worrying about the first kind of risk, individual risk, more than is warranted. And we are worrying less about the second kind of risk than is appropriate and desirable. Now, what happens if you do an overestimation of individual risk? What you have is people afraid for their lives. And people who are afraid for their lives, and I'm going to keep coming back to this notion, that fear in pandemic time is antithetical to the scientific temper. This is fear that leads us to a variety of irrational positions, including, in the social context, xenophobic positions. And we'll come back to this in a while, if time permits. But the risk to the community being underestimated has its own consequences. So that we underestimate the societal risk leads to the outcome that as a society, as civil society, the extent of our activism in demanding that our representative state and governments should function primarily to limit this societal risk by increasing public and free medical facilities that are appropriate, by increasing identification of cases and contact tracing with community partnership, with appropriate expenditures so that a decentralized public health system resilient enough to deal with the community risk can come into operation, that we should be thinking about sustainable responses rather than draconian lockdowns over extended periods of time, which are antithetical to the livelihood of the poor, that we should be asking for community solidarity, all of these issues begin to get less prominence in our societal discourse than is appropriate. It seems to me that we've even come up with the wrong phrase for what we should do in the COVID-19 pandemic. We say we need to maintain social distance. And I suggest to you that at the very least in this subcontinent, where social distancing, the idea of social distancing for the past 2,000 years has meant a hierarchical and iniquitous caste system, we should not be using this phrase. We should be saying physical distancing with social solidarity. And that we would do only if we see the distinction I'm arguing we need to between computed individual risk and community risk. And this is going to be my starting point about how I think the idea of scientific temper and the anxieties born from the COVID-19 pandemic are in collision. And it's a collision that all of us need to address and struggle against. So let me give you my next example of this perspective born of the COVID-19 pandemic that is antithetical to scientific temper. This is a notion that keeps cropping up everywhere. It crops up in social media, on WhatsApp and Facebook groups, and so on and so forth. But in this day and age, it also unfortunately crops up in the responsible statements made by people sitting in responsible positions and chairs. And the most striking example of that, though by no means the only example, is of course the President of the United States of America. And one such example of irresponsible statements that find a great deal of resonance in the fear of the pandemic is, this is unnatural. This is horrible. This is awful. And this is unnatural. And then we go from this cannot be just natural. It must be unnatural. It can't even be a natural virus. It must be an unnatural virus made by people for biological warfare. And this is a notion that has gone around so much that one of the first things that scientists, biologists began to do as soon as the sequences of a respectable number of virus isolates of SARS-CoV-2 began to be available was to do extensive analysis to see if there was any evidence at all that this was a manufactured virus. People have spent a great deal of time on this. There is absolutely no reason to believe that this is anything but a natural virus. It's extremely closely related, 95+% similarity with other coronavirus virus examples from bats. Some of its parts are very, very similar to other coronaviruses found in pangolins. It behaves, its sequences look, everything says it's yet another natural virus in a zoonotic leap from one species that it infects to another species, to another species, to another species. In the ecological world of host microbe interactions, this happens all the time. Our human footprint on the biosphere is now so large, so extensive, and so deep that it's unsurprising if these kinds of zoonotic transitions from non-human host species to humans happen somewhat more frequently. But it is fear that allows us to subscribe to conspiracy theories of this sort that are completely and utterly unfounded, despite people looking very hard for evidence of this kind. Somebody will turn around and say at this point, isn't it? That's simply absence of evidence. And absence of evidence is not the same thing as evidence of absence. So it still remains possible that the conspiracy theories are right. Regardless of that, in this particular case, I really don't think that the conspiracy theory is right. I don't think this is absence of evidence. I think there is some evidence of absence. But this brings me to yet another common difficulty that many of us who work in the science and society arena, such as the All India People's Science Network and the Tamil Nadu Forum and the Delhi Science Forum, which I belong to, have worked in, and that is that the idea of evidence that supports or argues against certain explanatory models of how something in the world works, the idea of evidence is rather a messy idea. More correctly, it's rather a quantitative idea, but more colloquially, it's a messy idea. And what do I mean by that? So let me give you, again, examples. What constitutes good evidence? And in COVID-19 times, what constitutes good evidence that hydroxychloroquine works as a drug against COVID-19, right? And ever since March, since a group of French physicians did a few observations in patients and published what I thought of then as a deeply premature paper claiming that hydroxychloroquine works in COVID-19, people, including, unsurprisingly, the president of the IISER, have been arguing that hydroxychloroquine works. It's a drug we know, it's a drug that many people take, it's a drug that's cheap and available, everybody can take it, we'll have dealt with the problem. We're done. Forgetting what I'm calling the messy nature of evidence. So when we think about evidence, do we make distinctions between what is simply an anecdote or an observation versus what is reliable, reproducible, and stringent? And the pressure of the COVID-19 pandemic and the fear surrounding it make, obviously, very large numbers of us lose that sense of distinction, perhaps including the Indian Council of Medical Research, for all I know. Since many countries have been advising hydroxychloroquine treatment without waiting for rigorous evidence that it does work. And over this past 2 days, the second of the rigorous clinical trials have begun to report that hydroxychloroquine in all likelihood does not work. So somebody is asking me, it has changed recently, and that's exactly what I'm commenting on. If anybody is following this, yesterday, the results coming out from the second clinical trial say again that it makes really no measurable difference. The first came out a week or so ago. That was a smaller study. This second one is a larger study. And so far, there is no rigorous evidence that hydroxychloroquine works. This is not to say that those studies should not have been done. This is to say it is those studies that should have been done, and those are the studies that we should have waited for. Let me take that argument one step further. Everybody is looking for antivirals against SARS-CoV-2, the virus. Right? Everybody is waiting for antivirals. And if you think about it, for all of us, we think about why isn't there an antiviral, with this notion in the back of our minds that if only there were like antibiotics for bacterial infections, there were good antivirals for viral infections, there would be no difficulty. And scientific temper demands that we are a little more circumspect and careful about how we think about it. So consider remdesivir, which in 2 separate clinical trials has been shown to have significant beneficial effect. In 1, maybe 2 trials, it has been shown not to have an effect. Still, there seems to be some evidence that it has a beneficial effect. But consider the beneficial effect of remdesivir. If you had a bacterial infection and a person in intensive care with a bacterial infection, and if you found an antibiotic that the bacteria were sensitive to, and if you gave the antibiotic, by and large, intensive care physicians expect that there would be a good response. The studies that showed that remdesivir has some effect did the following. In the control group, the median sort of average time when patients went home was 15 days. In the remdesivir treated group, it was, I think, 11 or 12 days. Mortality went from 12.5% to 8%. Now, here's the issue. The argument about whether these reductions were statistically significant or not is a separate one. But even if they were statistically significant, we cannot lose sight of the fact that the effect size, that the magnitude of the beneficial effect was relatively small. And this is related to the biological differences between how bacterial life cycles work and how viral life cycles work. And I will come to that later. But let me come to an even more science and society aspect of the COVID-19 pandemic that has come into prominence. And that is the great reportage of science. Everything that all of you have heard about treatments, vaccines, this, that, and the other, comes from a scientific source, but a scientific source that was not even available 10 years ago. That scientific source is the so-called public domain preprint server. In other words, scientists are doing work, they are writing up a paper, and they are simply uploading the paper onto a public website called medRxiv, bioRxiv. And since anybody can read those papers, what people are doing is reading the claims of the authors about what they have done and what their work means. And those claims are being reported as fact. Now, in the messy world of science, ordinarily, manuscripts would get submitted to peer review, peers would comment, peers would criticize, manuscripts would get rejected, manuscripts would go back and forth, would be revised, claims would be toned down, and so on and so forth. None of that filtering device is operative. And therefore, we are in the odd situation that we are taking self-declared claims from individual scientists to be factually correct. This is not necessarily true. And COVID-19 has actually thrown up this aspect of what we as a society should consider reliable science as no other epidemic has ever thrown up. A related problem there is, as some of our colleagues have been mentioning on chat, the other problem of the hydroxychloroquine mess, that correlation underlines. And that is the Lancet paper published last week and retracted this week has been retracted because the data from worldwide hospital sources that have been analyzed for that paper showing that not only that hydroxychloroquine doesn't work, but that it has an even higher death rate. Those data have been put together, curated, and analyzed not by publicly funded, transparent research groups, but by a for-profit company of data analytics. It's called Searchosphere. It's run by an Indian origin gentleman. And there are serious doubts about whether those data are appropriate, proper, and valid or not. Irrespective of the merits of that individual case, what it throws up is that COVID-19 pandemic is taking place in an era of unprecedented privatization. We now have public sector, university research groups and laboratories participating with private data analytical and related entities, for-profit entities, in the performance of ordinary research. What this does, both to lack of partisanship and transparency that we expect from our science and technology establishment, is itself a major question. Let me point very quickly to a few more issues that juxtapose scientific temper and these COVID-19 times. So we have a great anxiety for cure and prevention. And this anxiety for cure and preventions leads us to demand quick and miraculous cures. It demands cures without testing. Hydroxychloroquine on the one hand, a variety of homeopathic and related medications on the other hand, with all of which the issue ought to be not what the history of that medication is, but whether the evidence is rigorously reliable that it does have a beneficial effect or not. And then finally, I'm going to say that the pandemic has also begun to distort our broader societal perception of the domain of science and technology. So we want solutions without the appreciation that understanding how the world works is one of the prerequisites of designing solutions. More than that, we valorize science and technology. We valorize science and technology to the point, and this is going to be my last point, to a remarkably interesting point. Everybody is thinking about SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. And what is everybody asking? Why are the scientists not capable of making a vaccine? Why is it taking them so long? And there are, last I counted, 140 plus groups across the world making vaccine candidates making and testing vaccine candidates against SARS-CoV-2. There are 4 or 5 technologies, some technologies that are 200 years old, some technologies that are 20 years old. And all of these technologies are being deployed to make a vaccine candidate for SARS-CoV-2. We are going to get results of some benefit, not necessarily spectacular protection, but respectable, reasonable, significant protection by the end of this calendar year for more than one of those, I expect. But here's the point. My case is, we are looking at it as though it's a science and technology problem that new vaccines need to. And yet, if you look at all the 140 plus vaccine candidate development efforts, none of those are conceptually novel at all. Not one of those is conceptually novel. All of those are tried and tested in the laboratory in a variety of ways, in a variety of contexts. It's been obvious to those of us in the field, these are the ways that we will make vaccine. And with 140 groups across the world making them, some using this technology, some using that technology, we're going to get there. Is this worthwhile? Yes. Is this good work? Yes. Is this new, novel, conceptually astounding science and technology? Not at all. Is it a science and technology problem? No. Because the real problem will arrive when we have, let's say, 3 candidate vaccines in January that are ready to be deployed because their initial results say, oh, they show reasonable safety, reasonable efficacy. We can debate about what efficacy means, but reasonable efficacy. At that point, the real problem will face us. And that real problem is, how is a vaccine to reach everybody on Earth when the poor outnumber the rich by manyfold? How is the vaccine to be deployed such that it is available without economic hardship to everybody who needs it? And this is where what we are looking at as a science and technology problem will convert into what it always has been, which is a problem of the political economy, which is a problem of what is the idea of intellectual property rights in the time of COVID-19, what are the rights of society and of representative governments in overriding these so-called intellectual property rights, and how are these negotiations in the political economy domain going to move forward, and how are people's science movement going to do their share of the struggle in ensuring that the people come out as the beneficiaries in this. So the argument I'm therefore trying to make is that we range over a number of what have been common sticking points and problems in our own assimilation of scientific temper. But the COVID-19 pandemic provides us with both new, urgent, and pressingly consequential examples of these constraints and difficulties. I'm going to stop here, and I'm more than happy to answer questions, and I'm therefore going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see and address questions.
So for now, 2 questions. So can I read the question? Are you able to read the questions and answer it, or someone to read the question?
Why don't you read the questions?
Yeah. So the first question was, the issue of hydroxychloroquine has changed recently. Are there comments? And as I pointed out, I've commented on the most recent most recent data and outcome. If anybody has more specific hydroxychloroquine questions, I'm more than happy to address those. But in the meanwhile, let me go on to the other question. The question of any indication of correlation between global warming and COVID-19. So the correlations, if at all, seem to be indirect in two different ways. One, global warming is leading to population migrations and shifts in non-human species. So coronavirus family members are found quite extensively in bats, but also in civets, in pangolins, and in a whole range of related mammals, also in fact in birds. But the fact that animal populations respond to both global warming and to the anthropogenic effects on their environments, on their ecosystems, means that interactions between them and humans are likely to be more and more frequent. And since microbial leaps from one host species to another will be dependent on these close interactions between the host species, global warming certainly contributes to the likelihood of these interspecies transfers of infectious microbes. And in that sense, I would argue, made COVID-19 more likely, has made it more likely that, in fact, many such new infectious agents we will be faced with. I repeat, all of them are not going to be major killers. It's why we need to understand, which is where I started with, the magnitude of individual risk and the magnitude of societal risk in distinction from each other. But there is certainly that kind of an indirect but strong correlation between climate change and COVID-19. Climate change being the perhaps more accurate term rather than global warming. The status of drug or therapy. The status of drug or therapy at this point is fairly straightforward. There are no miraculously efficacious therapies available. At this point, I have seen tentative but reasonable evidence for three therapeutic interventions. One is remdesivir, which seems to work, albeit modestly. The second is type 1 interferon therapy, which seems to work a little bit better than remdesivir, but so far has had, I think, only one major clinical trial. And the third is, again, very tentatively plasma transfer therapy. And that has had a respectable effect, but the evidence in terms of numbers and in terms of the rigor of the evidence is still the weakest. Other than this, all therapies so far fall in the category of support therapy because infection leads to interruption of function of various organs, interruption of function of the lungs, of the heart, of the kidneys. Providing support in critical care units is really the mainstay of therapy. The next question is there any marked difference in the origin of the current virus from the earlier one? And the short answer is no. We still do not quite see the trajectory of how many different leaps back and forth between species got made before the emergence of this virus from an ancestral bat coronavirus. But that's true for SARS, that's true for MERS-CoV. So that's a common ambiguity. The precise pathway is extraordinarily hard to work out, simply because we don't have samples and material from all the intermediate ones. But apart from that ambiguity, there is really no marked difference in the origin of the current virus compared to the origin of earlier one. The next question is, what is the probability of potency of the potency or patents? Let me answer both questions. I suspect that in another few months, we will have quite respectable evidence that at least 2 or 3 vaccine candidates show reasonable protective efficacy. What I mean by reasonable is that they will reduce the chances of infection measurably and substantially, but they will be modest in that they're not going to bring it down to 0, which is what we expect of a first-generation vaccine. And that is certainly going to happen, is my guess. All of those are likely to be intellectual property right protected and will be partnerships between publicly funded government, people-funded research groups, and for-profit private sector companies. And therefore, intellectual property rights and patents are going to be a major, major bottleneck in ensuring that the vaccines begin to reach everyone. The next question is, COVID-19 seems to have the organization of society itself. Let me put it this way. COVID-19 follows the fault lines of societal organization. It follows the inequities of societal organization. In the United States, it kills African Americans far more than it kills European ethnicity people. In pretty much in the United Kingdom, it affects the BME community, the so-called non-white communities, much more. A great deal of this is to do not with the genetics of these ethnic groupings, but with the political economy and the socio-economic and socio-cultural discrimination organization of society. Remember that COVID-19 seriously affects people who have comorbidity, who have something else wrong with their health, who have, for example, morbid obesity driven by the fact that the only food that's cheap enough for them to get is non-nutritious, empty caloric junk food. people who have hypertension, people who have diabetes, people who have chronic obstructive lung disease, people who have chronic health problems. Very many people who have chronic health problems because they don't have as good and effective access both to preventive and to therapeutic health because of socioeconomic fault lines and considerations. And clearly, COVID-19 follows that, and therefore amplifies the socioeconomic and class hierarchies of society. The question about the source of the virus and its controversy. There is, based on how far back into 2019, autopsies on people who have died of mysterious diseases, mysterious illnesses, have now begun to reveal an occasional COVID-19 SARS-CoV-2 positive individual. People have begun wondering if it really originated in southern China, or if it in fact originated elsewhere as an infection. My guess, for what it is worth, and this is a guess because all of this is still evolving knowledge, my guess is that it quite likely, as Dr. Lee at the Wuhan Institute of Virology said, she pointed out that she has been saying for a long time that bats are major carriers of very large diversity of coronaviruses, and that this kind of transmission is sooner or later going to happen with some frequency. So my guess is that the current mainstream interpretation of the source of the virus is most probably going to turn out to be right. The next question is, can I comment on the role of the US election year and right-wing governments in many countries in driving the global reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic? Absolutely, I can. I think that the role has been heinous. The most depressingly dramatic example is Jair Bolsonaro's government, or at least presidency in Brazil, which has led to explosive growth of the numbers of cases and the numbers of deaths due to COVID-19 in Brazil, and clearly deeply right-wing, let me use a polite word, conservative, traditionalist political ideologies and positions are playing a major role. In the US, if anybody has been following this, once again, the argument that we are not the right-wing radical conservative argument that we are not a society with community responsibilities, that we are simply a group of individuals, means that people don't want to be thinking about community risk. People only want to be thinking about individual risk. And therefore, people do not want to be taking the kind of community health related care in cultural terms, such as physical distancing, such as wearing covers and masks over nose and face, such as maintaining relatively clean and decontaminated public surfaces and hand washing. All of this is driven very, very strongly by the rising right-wing xenophobic conservatism across the world. This is not simply true in the US and in Brazil. This is true in a number of countries across the world. But that said, let me say something else. More broadly, how should we respond to this community risk? And my argument is, what are we looking for? And what we are looking for is to keep the rate of spread of the virus as low as possible. We want the rate kept as low as possible for three separate reasons. One, we want the rate kept as low as possible so that our medical facilities can cope with the numbers of the seriously ill. Two, we want the rate kept as low as possible so that the chances of those amongst us with comorbidity, the elderly, the chronically unwell, their chances of getting severe infections are lower. And we want the rate of spread kept as low as possible so that we can eventually come to the point where the spread of vaccines across the world will immunize the bulk of us without our having to run any risk at all. All of these are absolutely fundamental in designing how we respond. And all of these, you will appreciate, are notions related to community health. And therefore, all of these are, they are not right-wing political positions. They are very much progressive, inclusive, collective community politics. And those are what we really need to be driving at. This comment of mine begins to address the next question. Don't I think failure of capitalism made an immense effect in this pandemic in Brazil, in the US, and in India? Let me put it this way. I think that the growing gulf as a consequence of the crony finance version of neoliberal capitalism that we've seen in the past decade have had an immense effect. But the really crucial issue in dealing with this pandemic in immediate terms has been over the past 30 years of neoliberal capitalism and its failures. And that is the absolute and complete absence of public sector manufacturing. We have no public sector manufacturing worth the name. And in consequence, we have been, not just we in India, although I speak primarily from my knowledge of India, but not simply in India, across the world, there is no such thing with an occasional exception like Cuba. As a result, personal protective equipment manufacture, mask manufacture, swab manufacture, little sticks that go into the swabs, the medium, the glass tubes, the syringes, the needles, not simply the high-end issue of is there a new vaccine or drug or not, but who is manufacturing diagnostic kits? No public good-oriented public sector manufacturer has been able to intervene in COVID-19, in the pandemic at all. The entirety of the intervention has been mediated by the free market, profit-oriented private sector. And my argument is that that has had an immense effect in the crucial early weeks and months of this pandemic, in allowing it to spread. The next question is, you've talked about research paper and privatization. Data information is kind of fourth industrial revolution, and privatization of it is only going to cause great damage. I couldn't agree with you more. So the example I gave you of the Lancet paper that has been withdrawn yesterday or the day before on hydroxychloroquine killing in excess, which does not seem to be terribly well supported, but the retraction has been because the paper has a private data analytics company exactly of this kind, the fourth industrial revolution company, and the fact that researchers from publicly funded research group felt that the private data analytics companies were appropriate partners speaks to how we have allowed our socio-cultural sphere in academic scholarship to be imbued with the free market notions of neoliberal capitalism. And it's therefore unsurprising that they did this. It's unsurprising also that they hastily retracted when they realized that this was not a good thing. But absolutely, the data information privatization is only one COVID-19 specific facet of a much larger problem. The next question is a lot of claims of traditional medicines in providing immunity by the government of India, and what is my take? So I have, as an immunologist of whatever kind and whatever competence, I'm afraid I'm deeply skeptical about any medication, and this is not about traditional or non-traditional medication. This is about any intervention to enhance immunity. Let me make a sort of scientific explanatory point here. All of us have an immune system that is quiescent in our body until an incoming microbe triggers it into activity. As soon as we say that we are going to intervene in this balance of quiescence and trigger, if we make it constitute, if rather than leaving it quiescent, we simply activate it with medicines and leave it activated, you can do this over the short term of a few days. But beyond that, it has consequences. It has consequences because it draws an enormous amount of energy. But more than that, see, the immunity activation, does it work against microbes? Absolutely. But in addition to working against microbes, it also causes some amount of tissue damage. So if you activate your immunity in your whole entire body, there are going to be inflammatory consequences to the body. None of this is simple or straightforward, as in, let me enhance my immunity or let me boost my immunity in some general non-specific fashion. And therefore, I am extremely skeptical of all claims that provide immunity or that boost immunity or that enhance immunity in people who are otherwise not immune suppressed. If you're immune suppressed as a consequence of a congenital illness, or you're immune suppressed because you have some cancer for which you've been taking cancer chemotherapy, or you're immune suppressed because you already have some autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis or lupus, and you're taking medication for that, then trying to provide some specific antiviral immunity may be worthwhile. But otherwise, I'm deeply skeptical about it. Comrades, you're going to have to tell me when to stop, because as long as there are questions, I will go on answering questions quite happily. So feel free to stop me whenever it is time.
We have time up to 4:30. No problem.
Okay. So the next question is it true that that if the origin of the virus is zoological, then development of vaccine is comparatively difficult? No. This is from P.K. Rajan. Can you clarify? I have not even heard this. So is there context to this? Because reading the question, since I have not heard this particular formulation, reading the question, I cannot off the top of my head think about any reason why an animal origin virus will make development of vaccine difficult. We can talk about what the difficulties in the development of a vaccine are, but none of those are specific to the zoonotic origin of the virus. So I would be really interested in what the context and the background of this particular formulation is. Let me move on, and hopefully PKR will comment and I can come back. The next question is, oh, no, that's just a comment. Okay. So then let me say something about the development of the vaccine and its comparative difficulty, because I see that quite a few people are typing. So while it comes through, so here's the issue. For any infectious agent, there is a network of interactions between the infectious microbe and the host species. And no two networks are identical. In other words, the way we respond to one coronavirus, let me exercise my hobby horse a little bit. Everybody, all of us talk about this as corona, and we really shouldn't. Because, as I said, this is simply one member of the coronavirus family, and 4 of the 7 members we are familiar with so far are completely innocuous viruses that cause common colds. So referring to SARS-CoV-2 as corona is sort of blackening the names of far more innocuous viruses. But even amongst coronaviruses, all of them are not going to have the same network of interactions, the same configuration of network of interactions with the human body. And as a result, using generic approaches to design vaccines is subject to this uncertainty that if the vaccine response does not interface productively with what I'm calling the network of interactions between virus and the human body, then the vaccine may not work. So the development of the vaccine is difficult in the sense that it's not, quite honestly, a deep knowledge-driven enterprise. It is, to a very significant extent, an empirical enterprise. It's trial and error. The positive side of it is that most vaccine efforts in this trial and error approach historically seem to work, at least to some extent. So that's sort of the tentative trade-offs in vaccine development. The next question is, I've talked about decentralization. Forgetting India as a group of federal states and centralizing and privating almost everything is only adding fuel to the fire. Absolutely, I agree entirely. In fact, let me push this a little bit further. In any given community, who is likely to suffer serious consequences of infection? Because who is likely to be having health difficulties already? Who is not? What is the distribution of the community? How are close contacts in the community configured and distributed? These are all matters of local, deep sociocultural knowledge. And here's my problem. If we want to not use the miserable hammer, crude weapon of a nationwide lockdown, which frankly converted a public health problem into a law and order problem in the hands of the police. If we don't want to do that, if we want to have a sustainable public policy to deal with COVID-19 such that it does not adversely impact the poorest and the most disempowered amongst us, then we need local community partnership. We need community groups to be skilled and trained to identify, with the participation of the community, potentially infected people. We need the communities partnering this so as not to ostracize people, but to recognize that they are simply markers of an ongoing societal problem. We need the state to provide the technological backup to these community health outreach teams. We need the state to provide the appropriate funding for the sustained presence and functioning of these community outreach teams. It is to this degree that we need the decentralization of the implementation of public health policies in the times of COVID-19. The next question is, kindly give your insight on the vaccine and trials in Oxford and also about remdesivir. So, okay. So let me pool two questions. One is, to what extent are the data coming out with regard to the vaccine so far reliable, and about vaccine and vaccine trials? So let me say a minute or two about how we make vaccine. What do we mean by a vaccine? We are going to put a mimic of infection into the body such that it's not going to cause disease, but the body and its immune system will see it as though it's the infection and will respond. That's it. That's a vaccine. So what I really want to do is to put something that looks like the virus into the body, but something that's not actually going to cause disease. So what's the easiest way of doing this? Go back 200 years to Louis, 150, 170 years to Louis Pasteur, take the virus itself, kill it or weaken it very much and inject it. This is the 200-year-old technology with which Sinovac, a Chinese company, is doing human trials with a vaccine. A second way of doing this is to take pieces of the virus, not the whole virus, but just the surface protein of the virus. Because the virus is going to have to infect cells, it has to recognize the cell in order to infect it. If you simply take the bit that recognizes and put that into the body, will make an immune response against that bit, will block the virus from infecting, and life is good. So we can make viral proteins and we can immunize with viral protein. And there are a whole range of laboratories across the world who are immunizing with viral protein. A third is, rather than making the viral protein outside the body, we simply put the information for the viral protein through a carrier virus or through just straight DNA or RNA injected into the body, and let the body make the viral protein and respond. And the Oxford trial is this kind of a virus, carrier virus, where it's a harmless virus that's carrying the information for the SARS-CoV-2 protein, so that when it's injected into the body, a few cells of the body will, that virus will infect, but not very much. Those cells will make the SARS-CoV-2 protein, and there will be an immune response. So that's the chimpanzee adenoviral vaccine of the National Institute at Oxford, which the Serum Institute of India here in Pune is also trying to make in partnership with the company partnerships everywhere, Sanofi, AstraZeneca, whatever. All of those are showing good responses in monkey trials. How reliable are those data? My guess is that those data are reasonably reliable. In other words, I don't think that anybody is likely to be hiding a completely non-useful vaccine by making up data. Is there likelihood that people are putting their best data foot forward? The answer is yes. But that, my guess today, is likely to happen both in the private sector and in the public sector, because even in the public sector, scientists and technologists want to be recognized as saviors, and therefore are likely to indulge in some advertising for themselves. The Oxford vaccine is, to my judgment, no better or worse than any of the other 4 technologies that are being tried by CanSino and Moderna, by the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, by a whole range of companies across and laboratories across the world. None of them has shown that there's anything particularly dramatically better about their approach than somebody else's approach. But at least we now have evidence that all these technology categories for vaccines that I'm talking about have all been validated to some extent in animal experimentation by generating immune responses that have protective characteristics. Since it's past 4:30, the last point is poor to rich inequality is day by day increasing, and our actions towards poor are also cruel. And how to overcome this is the real problem. And this is absolutely true. This is precisely what I meant when I said our imposed national radical draconian lockdown with 4 hours of notice and extended for more than 2 months is a classic example of converting a public sector, a public health problem into a law and order problem. And that's exactly what we have done. And law and order problems, we know how our police deal with our law and order problems. One major reason why we have done this is, in fact, that we have had this completely irrational idea that we can do battle with corona and we can eradicate the virus. There was never any chance of this. This is not a battle with an enemy. This is simply a natural phenomenon and a natural event that we have to deal with. This is not about winning or losing. This is about dealing with as much inclusiveness, as much constancy as possible as communities. And notions that if we do lockdown for a very long time, the virus will simply die out and we can just go back to life as it was and the neoliberal capitalist economy as it was. That was, I suspect, at least in part responsible for the extension of the lockdown, for the extraordinarily magnified miseries of the poor and the disempowered, and of what I'm still thinking of as the lack of sustainable public policy in terms of what I'm calling community health outreach teams in all communities, backed up both by the communities in which they work and by the government in support of the technological backup that they will need. None of this has happened. It's not my case that none of it is happening at all, but it's certainly my case that it has not happened to the extent that it should have happened and that it should have happened much earlier. And all of this is a consequence of the interface of socio-cultural right-wing conservatism and neoliberal capitalism. So I will stop there and I will thank everybody and hope that this has been useful.
Yes, sir, you have answered all the questions. We have exceeded 5 minutes for our schedule. I think it is time to wind up our session. I would like to thank all of you for attending the session and patiently hear the deliberation from Dr. Satyajit. I would like to thank Dr. Satyajit about the wonderful lecture he delivered. As usual, I request you to fill up the feedback forms once you are leaving the session. That will be helping us to organize it better than what we are doing now. We will be having more exciting